Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are here for the first time. Welcome back to those of you who were with us last week. This is SkanFest U, the Skinny Atlas Festival's educational program. And this year, we are looking into the many ways in which there are connections between music and nature. So thank you for being here. Just to recap, more coming. Briefly, from last week, you shared your experiences in nature. Some of you spoke up and told us the ways in which nature has touched and inspired you, the scenes which stick with you, and the ways in which nature is able to affect both our thoughts and our feelings. Then we went into considering how composers might turn that inspiration from nature into music. And we came up with a couple of ways in which they might do that. There are some ways in which music very easily depicts the natural world. Bird songs, for example, was one of the easiest, and we'll hear some more of that today. Waves, storms. Often these are sounds that exist in nature which can be drawn upon in concert music. Today we're going to hone in to start on the second, which is the ways music can create an atmosphere without actually imitating the sounds of nature. It can still give us the feeling we feel when we are in a natural environment. So we're going to focus on atmosphere and the nocturne in particular here. And then finally, we saw that nature can give us certain feelings, and since music is often considered the language of feelings to some degree, composers can go straight to that to try to create music which summons up the feeling which you get when you're in a natural environment. So those are three areas, and again, we're gonna hone in a little bit on the second. Just to recap the historical background, we saw that in the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and the Baroque era, nature was kind of seen as an intermediary between the divine or the heavenly and the human. This is music in the middle, and there's nature. It was a way of communicating between those opposites. But then in the 18th century, we saw that music becomes a bit more social and nature as well, in that there's an outdoor environment in which these individuals are pictured, they're dancing, they're making music together, and they're really never alone. They're always with other people. And that fits with the ideals of the Enlightenment, that we're better together than we are by ourselves, that humanity tends toward perfection, and if we all could just be wiser and more peaceful, humanity would be perfected. That has yet to happen, apparently. But that was the viewpoint of the 18th century, and we saw that reflected in some music. We saw it even reflected in gardening, the use of symmetry within gardens, such as here where Franz Joseph Haydn, the composer, was employed in this palace. The ideals of taming nature and making it symmetrical. Haydn had composed a great oratorio called The Creation, which sought to depict the very creation of the universe, the world, nature in all of its glory and beauty and detail, right down to the frogs, which he imitated. That was an area of much discussion. Then we had Beethoven after him, inspired by Haydn's creation, who used birdsong in his Sixth Symphony, as we found, trying most of all to summon up the feelings of cheerfulness, harmony that come when one goes out into nature, as Beethoven did here, where he wrote that Sixth Symphony directly inspired by the suburb of Vienna, Heiligenstadt, where he lived for a time during the summer months. And that came right through in the music, where Beethoven even labeled, there's the nightingale, and there's the quail, and there's the cuckoo. Right? So the sounds of nature found their way very quickly into music. But something changed profoundly into the 19th century. You can call it romanticism if you want. But we move from a sociable view of nature, where you go out together with other people and live in harmony, to a very individual perspective, where nature becomes more of a solitary experience. Now, why would that be? Well, there's a number of possible reasons for that, and some of them have to do with the foundations of Romanticism and the turning away from the Enlightenment ideals of the 18th century. So I can't get into that in too much detail, but in terms of philosophy, maybe you've heard of this guy called Kant, Immanuel Kant. Well, I'm not going to explain his philosophy to you today. I'm not even sure I fully understand it myself. But he did point out something very interesting, which other philosophers picked up on, is that the only thing we really know about the world is perceived through our senses. We have no real knowledge of whether there are objects in the world or even other people. We just know what we can sense. And there's really no way to prove that there are actual things in the world. Kant went into a lot of detail about this. And later philosophers therefore came to the conclusion that the self, us, and the object in the world, which could include nature, exist on a continuity with each other, and that are one and the same. Since nature is only what we sense through our senses, therefore that information is within us, and there's a continuity between the two, between nature. One later philosopher, Schelling, called this the absolute. There is this thing that exists out there, and might include God even, and we are part of it, but we don't fully understand it, and unfortunately we never really can. But nature therefore becomes a pathway. By sensing nature, we might intuit some deeper essence of the world, maybe even the divinity itself. And so now nature becomes an essential pathway that not only reflects ourselves, but allows us to deepen our wisdom and understanding of the essence of the world. Now, if that sounds very mysterious, I agree with you. It remains mysterious. But this is what philosophers thought, and it started to filter down to people as well. I'll read you a couple quotes. One is by Friedrich Schelling, a philosopher from this time, around 1810, was trying to understand the relationship between nature and music. And he said, only music can be an image of primal nature and its movement. For its whole essence also consists in circulation. As music circulates, it starts in a home key, goes through others, and comes back again. The same thing happens in nature. There are cycles, there are patterns. And so there starts to be this belief that there is something in common between music and nature. This is the brainy part of the class, so we're going to get to music very soon. So bear with me for another minute. Now, as you can see here, painters quickly took up the area of landscape painting. The one here, Caspar David Friedrich, was probably the greatest German Romantic painter. There was a big exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art of his work, the biggest ever in North America, just a few months ago. It was quite wonderful. But other painters as well, such as William Turner, the great British painter, went to Switzerland with his canvases and his paints and started methodically painting nature. Of course, you can see the mountain, the Rigi in Switzerland. Maybe some of you visited it. And the lake below. But it also contains with it a sense of human feeling. So it's not only the nature itself, but also what you feel when you see it. And where I'm going with this is that composers are going to try to do something similar to what painters are doing here. And in fact, some composers were actually painters themselves. Felix Mendelssohn, who was just way too talented for his own good even, he was a great watercolor painter in addition to a child prodigy. He composed amazing music when he was still a teenager. But he traveled as well to these places, Lake Lucerne. You might recall in the last class, we heard a little fragment of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, and the reason it's called the Moonlight Sonata is because around the same time Mendelssohn painted this, there was another guy, a German poet, Ludwig Rellstab, who went to Lake Lucerne, and he said that the opening of Beethoven's sonata sounded like the moonlight over Lake Lucerne. Why? Why does it sound like the moonlight over Lake Lucerne? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Beethoven never went to Lake Lucerne. He never called it the Moonlight Sonata. Well, does anybody have a thought on that? Why does it sound that way? Yes.
I think with any music, and again, I go back to mood, it evokes something in you, and then you associate that with another time and place. Mm-hmm. And you can superimpose certain memories or feelings.
Memory is a good word. Yes. Yes, that's a great point. So music really is just abstract sounds, right? Frequencies, hertz, in the scientific sense. But we associate some things with those sounds. And the grammar and language of music, which has been developed over hundreds of years, has associations with it. And maybe there's something about those chords that we associate with what? The movement of water? You know, that gentle pattern, the flow of water, the stillness, the quietude. Why moonlight? It's an interesting idea. You know, Beethoven said that the pianist he wrote a long Italian note, which maybe I can show you if I can find it. Yeah, well, I'm not even going to try to, well, it's not an eyesight test. But he says in Italian, very complicated Italian, you should hold the pedal down the entire time, which was a very new concept at the time. Usually pianists, when they use pedal at all in the classical era, they would change it frequently so that the tones don't blend together. But Beethoven asks you to just hold the pedal down for the entire movement without lifting it once. So the sound accumulates and creates a kind of resonance. And maybe the resonance of those vibrations in the piano have something to do with either the way we feel or the way we see such a scene. So the reason I'm honing in on this is because this is the era we're entering now, the Romantic era. This is when Beethoven's sonata became the Moonlight Sonata. Not when he wrote it, but later on. And we see these kinds of images in Romantic painting. The big thing they hone in on is atmosphere, right? This creates atmosphere, and then that evokes feelings within us. And so we're going to follow that a little bit today. The poet Friedrich Schiller, he's the one who Beethoven set the Ode to Joy to his poetry, said that there's a similarity between the composer and the landscape painter. He said both are soul painters because they penetrate beneath the outer appearance of things. So the painter's job is not merely to reproduce nature, but to penetrate it, to find the wisdom, the essence in it, the meaning in it. And the musician's role is the same, is to penetrate. So we're going to find ways in which composers are trying to do that today. And if we find this mystery, this could go with the Moonlight Sonata, this mystery in these paintings, and a lot of these painters like ruins or dead pieces of tree or maybe stone, something that is cryptic, then it becomes up to the viewer to make sense out of that. Like, what does that mean for you? Well, you could think about it and say, that shows you the passage of time and how, over time, everything decays. It's rather gloomy. Maybe there's some deeper meaning even than that within the painting, but that's really up to you as a viewer. And it's up to you as a listener when it comes to music. So I would encourage you to trust your instincts and convictions. That's what these romantic composers would like you to do, okay? This is the era of instinct, of intuition. So don't worry, the Enlightenment tells you you've got to study and learn and learn. No, don't worry. Just use your intuition, according to these romantics. Okay, now we're going to pick up here with the nocturne. This is a genre which emerged in the early Romantic era. The guy who invented it was from Ireland. His name is John Field. You may not have heard of him, and I would not fault you for that. He wrote nothing but piano music, and he had the misfortune of living right before Chopin. And so we now listen to Chopin's nocturnes, but we don't listen to his. But I would like to just introduce to you the sound of those nocturnes, and because it really was his invention that Chopin picked up on. And if you look closely, you'll see that he really stole the accompaniment right from the Moonlight Sonata. But he did something interesting with it. He added a melody on top. Beethoven has something of a melody in the Moonlight Sonata, but it's not really a singable melody. It's sort of a misty aura that floats over those moving notes. But here, Field writes dolente, which means sad and expressive. And what he did is he turned the melody into a kind of expression of the solitary individual who is out in nature during nighttime. And now we see in the Romantic era, it's really the melody that comes to represent the individual in the picture. So that person is not part of nature. That person is experiencing nature. Nature is underneath and around the melody. But the melody represents the person. So that's the first thing I'd like you to listen for. I think in a lot of this music, you can ask yourself, how is the melody asking me to feel? Because the melody is you. The melody is you as a listener. You're being asked to be like a singer. A lot of these melodies are singable as if they were opera arias, for example. But they don't have words. So you have to come up with the kind of meaning of what these melodies are. Let me play a little bit of this. So this is by John Field, and then we're going to hear what Chopin does with this idea. So most likely you recognize this. Right? Same idea. Any thoughts about what the melody might be expressing here? Again, it doesn't have words, so it's up to you to use your intuition. Discovery, okay? So the way it moves, it might be searching for something, looking, yes? Might play what? At a wake. Oh, okay. Yes, thank you. So this deep kind of sorrow that comes with loss, for example. And that fits with what the Italian marking is here, dolente, or sorrowful. Yes? Lonely. I like that. There's a fine line between solitude and loneliness. Very fine line. And I agree that the music you'll hear today often crosses over from one to the other. Yeah. Anyone else?
Longing.
Longing? Yes, longing is a buzzword for romantics. Infinite longing is the essence of romanticism. Yes?
I think what distinguishes it from solitude feels tranquil, while loneliness feels disturbed and unfinished, and those angular leaps are disturbing.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad you point out the leaps. If you look, the first 4 notes are leaping around, even though there's a slur, which indicates that they're connected or sung. If you sing music with a lot of leaps, you know what that feels like? It doesn't feel easy. It feels a little effortful, right, when we sing leaps. And so as a pianist, it is rather easy because it fits in my hand. But as a singer, you have to imagine those leaps and the expressive quality of, leaping down and then up and then down again like this. And in particular, this last interval, which I'll focus on today. The minor second is a highly expressive and dissonant interval. And that's exactly what Chopin is going to pick up on here. So now I'm going to play for you Chopin's version. So this was written around 1810. Chopin got a hold of it. And by age 17, he started to write his own nocturnes. Now, it's very easy to assume that Chopin was influenced by Field because he was the only one who had written nocturnes. And so Chopin, sure enough, he wrote a nocturne in E minor, the same key as Field's. And I'd like to play a little bit of that to see what Chopin does the same as Field and what he does differently. And maybe what he does better, but that's up to you. Thank you. Thank you. So, this is called a nocturne, so we can assume it's at night. Did anybody have a particular image that came to mind? And you don't have to either. I will say, you know, some of us pass more quickly to the area of feeling, not necessarily the visual. So, but some people do have very strong visual associations. So I'm curious whether anybody, yes?
So what I saw was a young person thrilled by the size and grandeur of the night, this ever-expanding panoply. And there was a relishing of the night, whereas the first round of Fields, I felt that there was something sad, this loss that we talked about. This, for me, I imagine someone who's fine knowing that there's a promise of daybreak, and that's good. But for right now, it's this present moment that seems to matter.
I think that's very sensitive. That the point was that as a young person, enraptured by the nighttime, but with a sense of hope, not necessarily, you know, doom and gloom, as we heard a little bit in the field. And that certainly fits Chopin. Again, he's only 17 years old. Well, some people would call that genius, I guess. And certainly that's a buzzword of romanticism as well. But there's an individuality, but maybe it's a young person's individuality. That's interesting. Yeah, anybody else have a view? Yes?
It reminded me of being taking care of my newborn babies in the night.
Okay, so a kind of, the stillness, the quietude of having a baby, putting a baby to sleep. And certainly the music does go to sleep at the end, it seems to. It kind of fades off in a major key rather than the minor key it starts with. Now, one thing you might notice that Chopin did differently from Field is where Field put the accompaniment right where Beethoven does, in the middle here. Right? Just like Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Right? Chopin spreads it out over the entire left hand. So it goes down to the bottom of the piano and all the way up again. And that's typical of almost all Chopin's music. By letting the hand be extremely flexible, he allows it to cover a much greater distance than classical music typically does. And what that does is it creates resonance. It allows the piano to resonate. It's very different than, right? So that really is a foundation for what will become atmosphere in music. That you can create a mystery or even a cloud of sound by using the pedal in conjunction with a wider spread of the notes. And one thing, I think an ingenious thing that Chopin does, is he uses this half step to create a kind of sighing feeling, or maybe a melancholy, or maybe something which is slightly haunted. Now, Field had used that half step too in the melody up here, but Chopin uses it in the accompaniment. And then he hides it in the melody as well. And I don't have time to go into all of that, but I'll give you one example near the start. These are all half steps, and Chopin is kind of embedding that half step into the music. So that kind of sophistication gives us an inkling that there's something deeper in this music that penetrates the surface of things. And the same thing is what romantics were looking for from nature. That yes, I see birds and I see a lake and I see the moonlight, but there's something deeper than that. I feel something, whether it's the divine or just some kind of deeper wisdom in the universe. I start to intuit that. And so that's one way in which music can do this. Now, what's missing from Chopin's Nocturne is any kind of explicit depiction of nature, right? Maybe we could say that the left hand is some kind of waves, if you hear it that way. You don't have to. But we don't have anything labeled in the music saying this is a bird or this is the waves. So later composers would go a bit more in that direction. I wanted to give you one more example of the nocturne before we leave that genre, and this one is by Edvard Grieg. Now, landscape painting had also come to Norway. In fact, a contemporary successor of Friedrich in Germany, Hans Gude, he portrayed the Norwegian fjords. Maybe some of you have been there. I have not, but I hear it's spectacularly beautiful. Here's another image from that called Night Clouds. And Grieg does something similar in one of his lyric pieces. Now, these pieces were designed to pick up on Norwegian folk idioms and settings. Last week, at the end of class, we heard a piece by Dvořák, a contemporary of Grieg, called Silent Woods. And that was from a set of pieces called From the Bohemian Forest. So that was from the Czech area of Europe, and now we're going to Norway. And Grieg calls this piece Notturno, or Nocturne. And here he's going to make the nature more explicit. And I wanted to just give you an example of that before you hear the piece. So first, the most obvious way nature is depicted in music usually is birdsong. And you can usually identify the bird. I'll give you the example here. It sounds like this. So we hear that kind of chirping, right? I'm not sure which bird it is. I'm not a birder. Maybe one of you can identify it. That would be interesting if we could. Later in the last class, we'll come to music by Olivier Messiaen, where he actually writes in the name of the bird, whichever one it is. But Grieg didn't do that, so I'm not sure which birds inhabit Norway. But you can certainly listen for that. Now, another thing we learned from the Nocturne already is that there's usually a human presence in this scene. You have the scene itself and then the human presence. And again, I would listen for the melody. One way that composers give a sense of the human in music from this era is to use what's called chromaticism. Chopin had used that half step. And I'll give you an example of that, I think, which is the most sort of human melody here. So that melody which rings out above, it's highly expressive. And Grieg marks tenutos, little markings over every single note, like you're feeling it. But there's also this undulating quality in the music. It's a kind of a rhythm, this thing. And we recognize that from nature, right? The sort of background noises. And if you listen really closely, they have a kind of a rhythm. Maybe some of you hear that outside your houses at night or something, the sort of crickets, and they all blend together into a kind of, hazy sound, but there's a little bit of rhythm there somehow that you hear as well. So Grieg gives us that. There's another mysterious call. I don't know if it's a bird call, but you'll hear it in the distance. What that is, I'm not quite sure. Maybe one of you has an idea about that. So we have these nature sounds, we have the human, and they're going to come together in this nocturne. Again, the idea is for you to envision that scene in the way that you see it, but then to intuit some deeper meaning or expression through your feelings. The Romantics really prioritize feeling and intuition. So again, whatever you feel is the right thing to feel. Thank you. So here Grieg has moved more explicitly into nature. Anybody willing to share their thoughts and feelings or scenes that they see if it's a depiction? Yes.
I remember there were moments when the right hand would dissolve or the left hand was like, no, we're not dissolving. And yet created this like conflict with that, like there's one side where there's this sort of peacefulness and then there's this
Yes, yes. So existing in the music, thank you for that comment, is both a kind of peacefulness, but also a kind of yearning that feels unresolved, this kind of chromaticism. So what does that mean for those two to be together? Yes?
His home in Bergen is way up in the air, looking out over the city itself. And he had a separate outbuilding right on the edge of that escarpment where he did his composition work, from what I understand.
Yes.
And so I envision that he's sitting there looking out the windows possibly, or sketching something on a bench. Maybe there are a couple of old benches there where you can look out over into the city. So.
Thank you. It sounds like you've been there to this house in Bergen, Norway, where Grieg lived, and explaining that it's sort of looking out over nature in this way. And so these sounds may be, literally what he heard. Yes?
Aaron, is some of that tension due to the fact that he's gone away from typical tonic dominant musicality? And this sounded very much like Debussy to me.
Yeah, so there is something in common with Debussy, whose music we'll look at next week. Yes, the harmony is constantly changing. Again, to pick up on the earlier comment, it's chromatic and not resolving very easily. It does at the end, but it's kind of shifting and changing. And that's becoming part of the late Romantic musical expression. This piece was written actually in the very same year that Dvořák wrote the piece from last week, Silent Woods. So woods are very much on the memory of these, or the minds of these composers, and the fact that the bird is there does suggest perhaps a wooded scene. It's possible, at least. Grieg, although he was Norwegian, studied in Germany and was well aware that in Germany, the forest in particular is of fascination and a big topic in German folklore. Some of you have doubtless read the fairy tales of the Grimms, and many of those take place in the forest, right? Hansel and Gretel, for example, and other such tales. And we see this fascination with composers, not only with the nighttime, but also with the forest. And I'd like to pick up on that in the last piece we'll hear today from some very special guest musicians in just a moment. But the forest becomes a kind of reflection of the psyche of the person in it. There are dark corners you don't really want to think about, right? And so the forest becomes this kind of, parallel to our own minds or our own hearts. And composers will pick up on that more explicitly too. Before we hear this last piece, just to give you a precursor, Robert Schumann wrote a whole set of pieces called Waldzähne, and here's the first edition of the music, and you can see the woods are literally surrounding the title, Forest Scenes here. And in the opening of that, which is called Entrance, or Eintritt, means to go into the forest, he uses some of the sounds that German musicians would associate with the forest. And one of those is the horn. The horn for Germans, the natural horn, is an outdoor instrument, and it calls from the distance. It's a way of communicating, really. Today, if you go to Germany or Austria, it's associated with the post office. It's the symbol for the post office, and it tells you the mail is on the way from the distance. You better come out and get your mail. And Schumann uses the sound of the horn. Now, how do I know the sound of the horn when it's played on the piano? Well, horns play in a certain range, right in the middle of the keyboard, and they play certain intervals, these intervals. Like that. If that sounds like a horn to you. Horns have played those intervals for hundreds of years at this point, so it's into Baroque music way back. Anyways, Schumann uses the sound of the horn, but then he uses the right hand as an echo of the horn. And so it's like the horn is echoing in the distance of the forest. I'll play just an opening phrase. So we first hear the sound of the horn, and then the melody emerges. And that, again, represents the individual, the person in the scene, right? So the horn and the echo tells us is outdoors and in the forest, but then the melody comes, and that's the person. So this would be a framework that later composers could pick up on as well in their depictions of nature. Well, we have one final work to hear today, and I'm wondering if our guests, Ziggy and Miles, are nearby. Are they? Oh, they're in the back. Oh no, they've been listening to me the whole time. I'm so happy to welcome these terrific musicians, brothers, to the festival for the first time. Welcome. It's great to have you both. They've been hard at work already. How many times have you played already since this week? This is number 3 already. They've been in Ithaca, they've been in Syracuse, and they're going around the region to share their music with the community. And they have a song for us today to share, which fits our theme, called Songs of the Forest. And this is by an Australian composer. Full disclosure, you're from Australia.
Yes.
And a composer who writes beautifully for the guitar. And I'll turn the mic over to you, and maybe you want to say something about the piece.
Hi everyone. So, yes, as Aaron mentioned, we're playing a piece called Songs from the Forest by Nigel Westlake. And Nigel is a very big environmentalist himself. So is his father. His father was the principal clarinetist of the Sydney Symphony. And then Nigel also became a clarinetist, but also focused on composition very heavily. And throughout his life, he's had a big focus on pieces that involve messages about nature and preservation. And this piece was written in 1994, which was written while he was living in a tree house in New South Wales. So it really does kind of, in a forest in New South Wales, I should say. So it was kind of a period in his life where he was focusing on that connection with nature. And something that he is known internationally for is, who here remembers the movie Babe with the talking pig? Yep. So he wrote the music to Babe. Almost 30 years ago today, that movie was released. It was released 30 years ago as of yesterday. And he wrote this piece, Songs from the Forest, 1 year before that.
So in his music, there are obviously themes or elements of film music. This piece itself, each different section kind of has its own character. And in his works in general, he takes different approaches to conveying nature. In some, it's more literal depictions, whether it be of things that he saw in certain locations. This piece in particular, though, is more about the atmosphere than any particular imagery. So each different section kind of conveys different atmospheres, different moods surrounding what he was feeling while he was living in this tree house in a forest in New South Wales.
And one of those sections even includes one about looking at the stars. So there's a section towards the end where we have a very synchronized section of only harmonics, which is sort of signifying the stars that he would look up at in the evening, which is kind of in all of our lives a bit of a experience, because he was in the middle of nowhere, where you could actually see all the stars and all the constellations, where you can't see that in any major cities.
Also, we should note that it definitely focuses on the nicer parts of Australian nature. There's no sections focusing on spiders or snakes or anything like that.
Yeah, so here is Songs from the Forest by Nigel Westlake.
Thank you both so much for sharing that with us. It really enhances everything we've been talking about. I can certainly see the stars you mentioned with those high sounds. I'm curious whether, one of the things we've been discussing in the class is how music can be both abstract, just abstract sound, or it can call to mind visual images or feelings. I'm curious, when you play this piece, which you obviously know very well because you didn't use any music at all, whether you're focused on the abstract qualities of the music, how to execute it, or whether there is some kind of a visual image or a sense of feeling about the piece when you play it?
I would say it's very section dependent to answer that question, because obviously the opening and closing sections of the piece are a lot more sort of virtuosic and show off the instrument as kind of a statement about this is what two guitars can do. Then I'd say for me more so the inner sections is what depicts more so the feelings that Nigel was having in those forests, and particularly the slower section, there's some improvised sort of melodies, which are all written out, but it's to have that improvised feeling, which, there's always an unpredictability to nature.
And that's another thing, because we know Nigel and we've worked with him on other pieces, and he talked to us about his writing process for this piece at one point. And his goal with this piece was to write a piece that was entertaining for audiences, but also to convey the nature element that's so important to him and while he was writing the piece. So that's obviously present in the opening sections, but there is really unsettling feelings, especially the second section as it moves into the triplets. As you were talking about the Grieg, or right after talking about the Grieg, talking about forests and how they are, there's lots of danger inherently in them. That triggered stuff with me thinking about this piece that I hadn't thought about before. Partially because it's like, with Australian landscapes, obviously we have deserts, we have forests, we have beaches, but you never really want to spend time in forests. We don't have bears, but we have much smaller, more dangerous things. So it kind of, in some ways, goes without us thinking about it just because it's, well, yeah. I don't have experience dealing with spiders in forests, but it kind of rings true with that unsettling nature and the darker, mysterious side of what is in a forest.
Thank you. I know that, or I believe, am I correct, you're playing another work by Nigel's, is it tomorrow or tomorrow? And that's that performance, which I believe is at First May Memorial in DeWitt. I can't remember the time, but I know it's on page 10 of your program books. If you, maybe it's 1:30 or 1:30. Okay, and that's an extended piece, I know, with lots of different nature imagery within it. So if any of you are inclined to come and explore that, that's quite a piece, isn't it? 23. Wow.
Yeah, just a short description of this piece. So it's a 23-minute sonata for two guitars, And it was written shortly after his son passed away from a road rage incident in Sydney. And he wrote this piece, coming to terms with it. In doing so, he visited a bunch of locations, remote locations on the east coast of Australia that were important to him, his son, his family. And he erected shrines, small shrines in memory of his son. And he erected these, some on beaches, in forests, on the top of mountains, but also some underwater, knowing that they'd be washed away and removed with the elements.
And some of these are more literal depictions of these particular locations, and some is more so about the journey getting to these locations, because they are very remote, and some are literally on the tops of cliffs. So it's a mixture of the feeling of coming to terms with obviously such a tremendous loss, the feelings of memories that he had with his family at these locations, then also of the land itself.
Fascinating. So a pretty profound combination of both the feelings of nature, but also very private, personal, and intense feelings. So yeah, I'd encourage you to come listen if you're able. I think we're just about out of time for today. I can take one or two questions for Ziggy and Miles. Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask? Yes.
When you said he was in the forest, was he like in the tablelands, or was he like in the northern, in the interior?
Do we know which part of Australia he was in?
He was in a forest just outside of Sydney, because he lives in Sydney, so he's very familiar with that sort of area. And I believe he was in a tree house. I don't know whether that's one that he created himself or it's one that was already there, but yeah, so it was a forest just outside of Sydney. I don't know which forest it was, though.
I don't remember.
One more question, anyone? Okay, well, you'll have an opportunity to talk with Ziggy and Miles. They're going to be here all week. Just a note as we close for today, a reminder that today at 6 o'clock, about an hour from now, there is a nature walk at Baltimore Woods, which is only about 7 or 8 minutes from here. And Ziggy and Miles will be playing there, so I need to release them to let them go get set up for that. Along with our Robinson Award winner, Abigail Fung, will be playing cello, and Native American Onondaga wood flute player, Curtis Waterman, will be there as well. So if you're able to join us, yes, question?
The program does say 6 and 6:30, is that true?
Is that true? Initially, we had thought we might do them timed at half-an-hour intervals, but we're not. It's going to be, you can move at your own pace from station to station, so you're welcome to come anytime between 6 and 7. Thank you, everybody. I hope to see you there or next week. And thank you, Ziggy and Miles.